Can you even? Imagine the gall of just balling up a bunch of junk, throwing it at, somebody who worked for you, and then saying, return this stuff, please. I don't know where it came from. Clothing with food stains? Disheveled, broken, used, and thinking that the store is supposed to take it back. What are they supposed to do with all this broken stuff, all these junky clothes, all these dirty linens? What are they supposed to do with this? Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to keep going in The Other Mrs. Kennedy. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the fact that Ethel is not doing well financially, and one of her big schemes is to buy things with the express intent of returning them. So she is obviously not the first person to ever come up with this scheme, but she might be one of the only people I've heard of who did it so often and who trashed the items she bought and then expected the stores to take them back. So when I tell you that this chapter is exceedingly delicious in its details, I am not lying to you. So let's get straight into it. This chapter is entitled Little Brown Bag. Despite all of his efforts, Steve Smith ultimately waged a losing battle to impose fiscal restraint on Ethel, who had now devised a unique way to make it appear that she was cutting back. She just stopped sending a number of her bills to the park agency. Ethel had started getting dunning letters from creditors for amounts as small as $11.45. That one was from President Nixon's New York business manager, Vincent S. Andrews, whose firm had arranged with the messenger service to pick up a movie in Manhattan for showing at the Hickory Hill parties. Ethel had never paid the bill. Merchants began calling the Senate. That's how bad it got, chuckled Richard Burke, who had been an aide to Ted Kennedy. Ethel was definitely unwilling to deal with any of her creditors. It got totally out of control. The house was in chaos, and she was grabbing at anybody who would give her some administrative help. When the calls came in from the bill collectors, they came to my desk. I remember she owed one local grocer $1,100, and he was screaming on the phone for his money. I called the office in New York and asked why the bill hadn't been paid. Joe Hakem, an aggressive guy who was running the park agency office for Steve Smith, said, "I'm looking at her accounts, and we have no back bills. The problem is she doesn't send them to us." Finally, I talked to the senator and said, Hickory Hill is just a mess. Steve flew down and talked to Ethel. She complained during the meeting that she didn't have enough to live on. She admitted that she'd let the bills pile up until it became a crisis, and then they'd have to pay. She was acting like a little girl. "I have responsibilities. I need money for the children, for the house, for the servants." Then Steve would point out all those excessive expenditures that she'd made, like flying everybody first class to Aspen. And then when they got there, they had destroyed the place. The owner of one condo called me at the office and pleaded with me. "You have to do something. Her kids threw a cherry bomb in the toilet and blew it apart. They just threw out the toilet." We had to pay for it. I remember he sent us a bill for $8,000 or $10,000. The senator looked at me and laughed. He said, "Talk to Steve in New York and let him deal with it." Afterward, the condo owner called and said, "Never again. No more Kennedys. Absolutely not." But this going to a place and destroying it was not just this one-off. Throwing a cherry bomb in the toilet and blowing it apart and then not paying for it and just sort of leaving and hoping that somebody would figure out how to pay for the repairs to the place that they had stayed at. That's not a one-off. It would appear that wherever Ethel took her clan, they just took it as their mission to destroy the place they stayed in. It says here, at one point, Ethel wangled an invitation to borrow her pal Avril Harriman's Sun Valley ski cottage. The two had been friends for years. After Harriman's first wife, Marie, died in September 1970, he gave her wedding ring to Ethel because Marie and Ethel had been so close, and Ethel continued to wear the ring years later. She also had been one of the witnesses at Harriman's next marriage to Pamela. But despite their close ties, Ethel and her crew all but gutted Harriman's Idaho getaway house, packing the tiny place with some 30 people and abandoning it dirty with cigarette burns in the rugs. How is that the way you would treat a friend who allowed you to stay in his ski cottage and then you pack the place with 30 people, destroy it, and then just leave? It got so bad that a number of real estate agents were reluctant to rent to Ethel, who one year resorted to using the alias John Wilbur in order to get a place. The co-owner of the Aspen Club Spa finally denied access to the Kennedys because, quote, "the kids were utterly wild. If they ate a meal, half of it was ground into the carpet. They were like banshees." Added Burke, Ethel never really gave Steve an excuse for her spending. Steve finally said, she's not going to be controllable. She's just going to be like this. She can't be left to stay within a budget. When the bills came, Ted often said, why doesn't she use her own money? Skakel money. Ted had a fondness for Ethel, but they weren't particularly close, as the public generally thought. He treated her almost like a sick sister, talked down to her. He couldn't call Ethel and discuss anything with her. It was always an afterthought to include her. Jean and Eunice were the important ones. A number of small merchants in McLean were left holding the bag for months before they were paid. For a while it seemed Ethel just paid her bills in January, recalled one McLean merchant, which meant that if you did something for her in February, you'd wait a year to get paid. Don Burns, owner of Burns Brothers Cleaners, recalled that Ethel had been behind in her bill to him for as much as several $1,000s, and that's not an exaggeration. He said, we had a terrible time getting her to sit down and write the checks. He said he finally got the matter settled by demanding that her secretary be given the authority to write and sign checks for household account items. Besides the slow payments, Burns found Ethel extremely demanding. One secretary would come in with a pile of clothing to be cleaned at 3 o'clock, and another would come back for it half an hour later. There was no organization. Do these people not know how the world works? Why are you wasting time of the people that you employ, having one person go to the cleaners at 3 and then at 3:30 another person is coming being like, I've come for the cleaning. Did they not receive a ticket that said when the cleaning would be ready? But they just disregard it and think that they can just show up and the clothes are going to be magically clean, that somebody's back there just waving a wand? Among the many cars the Kennedys had at Hickory Hill, Bobby's favorite had been a 1966 white Ford convertible. After his death, the car developed mechanical problems, and Ethel had one of her people call Bobby Jones at B&M Exxon, a couple of miles from Hickory Hill, to pick it up and check it out. The car, which still sported old New York plates from when Bobby was a senator, was towed to the shop. Nobody had put oil in it, and they just drove it until the engine blew up. Jones recalled. He telephoned Hickory Hill and gave his diagnosis to a member of Ethel's staff with a $500 repair estimate. They were supposed to let me know what to do, but they never did, Jones said. The car sat on the lot for 2 years, abandoned. Finally, I called and said that if they weren't going to fix it, I had to be paid for storage. Ethel signed over the title to me, and I dropped a new engine in it. I drove that car for 4 or 5 years before I sold it, which I wish I'd never done because those cars are classics today. Jones said he had done other auto work for Ethel. It sometimes took 2, 3, 6 months to get paid. Another McLean merchant, who sold Ethel half a dozen bathing suits, was forced to wait 6 months for payment. A local plumber said, it got so I didn't want to go out there and do any work because it took so long to get paid, and the plumbing at Hickory Hill was a mess. A friend of Ethel's, unaware of her spending habits, happened to be at Best & Co. when one of Ethel's secretaries came in with a long list of items, which she told the saleswoman to put on Mrs. Kennedy's charge. After Ethel's assistant left, the saleswoman chuckled, saying, I wonder when we'll get paid. A prominent Georgetown antique dealer in the 70s, Peter Mac Brown, was paid late by Ethel for items that she had purchased. On occasion, Ethel would also take pieces, such as an antique chair, on approval, have a party, use it, and bring it back the next Monday, said Michael Lehman, a friend and a longtime associate of Brown's. Peter was very free about it. Customers would often take things out on approval, but I think it became kind of a habit with her. She was standing out, and because of her name, she got away with it. In trying to cut her expenses, Ethel had begun bargaining for better deals by invoking the Kennedy name and playing on people's sympathy about her widowhood. Don't you realize who you're talking to? She'd say to shopkeepers. I'm Mrs. Robert F. Kennedy. Don't you know how much I buy from you? Can I get a better price? She felt victorious, said Noelle Fell, if she secured a 10% discount. Friends recalled that Ethel also attempted to trade on her name in order to secure goods, such as skis and tennis rackets, for free. She believed that the name Ethel Kennedy was a good endorsement for a product, a member of the circle recalled. She was always trying to hustle that way. Whenever there was a big event now at Hickory Hill, Ethel arranged through Ted's Senate office to get loaner cars from local dealerships to transport guests. We'd go to the local Pontiac dealership and say, listen, we'll thank you in the program if you give us 10 cars, recalled Richard Burke. Ethel used the Kennedy office all the time. If there was an immigration problem with any of the people who worked for her, we were always involved with it. We were using Senate employees to do errands for her. A disgrace is what this is. Mary DeGrace, who had worked as a laundress for Ethel at the compound for years, receiving only a minimum wage and only one gift, a picture of Bobby after his death, quit when Ethel accused her of conspiracy to rip her off. She thought I was sending out too many things to be cleaned. Ethel came into the laundry room and told me, "You must be in cahoots with the laundryman. My laundry bill so far this year comes to $700, and you're going to pay for it." So I told her that she could wish with one hand and shit in the other and see which one filled up first. And then I threw down the iron and I walked out of the door. I don't even understand that insult. Ethel's failure to cut her spending infuriated her mother-in-law. The worst thing Ethel could do, in Mrs. Kennedy's eyes, was be extravagant, said Rose's secretary, Barbara Gibson. That was a big thing with Mrs. Kennedy because she was really stingy. She hated giving things to people, and she hated the idea of anyone taking from her. Rose Kennedy was especially furious when she heard the stories about Ethel's shopping sprees. One, in particular, involved a fashion show in New York, where Ethel bought a Mary McFadden dress in 5 different colors, and then at Bergdorf's snapped up a half-dozen of the same expensive belt in different hues. In order to get Steve Smith and Rose off her back, Ethel devised another scheme, dubbed Shop Return, to give the park agency the illusion that she'd finally gotten into line fiscally. She began using her power and respected name, Mrs. Robert F. Kennedy, to buy, use, and return items with impunity. After a time, some merchants wanted to bar their doors when they saw her coming. Others prayed she wouldn't return at all. Ethel's first visit to Saks West End, a Tony designer boutique in Chevy Chase, Maryland, was a memorable experience, employees recalled. After a bit of browsing, Ethel approached Jane Abraham, the assistant manager, telling her she needed a dress for an upcoming event. Ethel then proceeded to pick out 4 or 5 pieces, finally choosing a pretty $750 black organza with a white collar by Oleg Cassini. She looked quite nice in it, Abraham recalled. Rather than paying cash or using a credit card, Ethel asked to open a house account, delighting the shop manager. Having a Kennedy woman as a customer, any savvy retailer knew, could only generate good publicity and more business, even though they could be difficult to deal with. The dress was wrapped, and Ethel was ushered to her car with a profusion of, "Thank you, Mrs. Kennedy, please come back again." After Ethel drove away, the shop owners, Ernest and Henry Marks, were ecstatic. "Jane, you're wonderful," she quoted them as saying, "My God, you sold Ethel Kennedy a dress." But a week later, Jane Abraham was leafing through the newspapers, and she came across a picture of Ethel wearing the dress. Thinking it would be good publicity for the store, she clipped and filed the item. A few days later, one of Ethel's servants arrived at the shop with the dress. The maid said that Mrs. Kennedy had worn it and wanted to return it, Abraham said. "I thought to myself, what gall that woman has." To make matters worse, Abraham said, the dress looked like a limp rag. It was dirty and had food stains on it. I said, "Mrs. Kennedy was photographed wearing that dress. I have a picture of her wearing that dress. You better take it back." Abraham could tell that the servant was distraught, knowing she'd have to return to Hickory Hill with the garment. So I told her, "Tell Mrs. Kennedy we're not in the used clothing business. If there's a problem, have her call me." Abraham thought that would be the end of it, but was soon proven wrong. Another Kennedy housemaid arrived at the shop, this time with the dress on a hanger in a plastic bag, sporting a little paper collar from a dry cleaning establishment. The dress was still a bit limp because the cleaning hadn't sized it, which would have restored some stiffness to the fabric, Abraham said. Once again, Abraham was forced to tell the Kennedy employee that the dress had been worn. "It's clean! It's clean!" she replied. "Wait here," Abraham told the maid. Furious, she marched over to her desk and picked up her pen. "Dear Mrs. Kennedy," Abraham recalled writing, "I'm terribly sorry, but the dress has been altered. The dress has been cleaned, and we are not a second-hand store. If you don't care for the dress after wearing it, why don't you try selling it to one of the second-hand stores? There's Encores, there's Think New, there's Next to New." To make her case as direct as possible, Abraham attached the clipping that showed Ethel wearing the dress. The saleswoman noted, "It happens to look wonderful on you, and I'm sure that if you do wear it again, you'll get great pleasure from it." When several months had passed and Ethel still hadn't paid her bill for the dress, Jane Abraham met with the Marx brothers. I said, "She didn't pay for the dress. Who needs more aggravation from her?" They didn't know what to do because at that time the Kennedys were held in very high esteem in this town. The owners were naturally disappointed that they'd lost such a well-known customer, but they decided not to press for the payment. No one in the shop expected to see Ethel again. But about a year later, she marched in, eager to buy and charge more clothing. "We did not sell her another dress," Abraham recalled. "She left empty-handed." Abraham maintained that the management had decided not to allow her to shop or charge anything. She'd essentially been banned. She was asked to take her business elsewhere. Ethel was not happy, Abraham remembered. "She raised her voice some. She got kind of sassy and snotty, but she didn't throw anything at me." Imagine, what sort of uncouth behavior have you experienced where you leave the encounter thinking, well, thank God they didn't get so mad they threw something at me? Because a person has to be pretty mad for you to ever think that that was a possibility. Ethel also shopped at the Chevy Chase, Maryland, Saks Fifth Avenue, where she arranged to have selections of apparel delivered to Hickory Hill on approval. She always expected a great deal of attention, and that was kind of annoying, said a longtime Saks employee. Her secretary often called and asked us to send our clothes to Hickory Hill on a consignment basis. Those orders were handled in a special book at the store. We'd send out 50 things, one dress would be picked out, and 49 would come back. In general, the Robert Kennedy's return rate was tremendous. It got to the point where if a telephone call came in from Hickory Hill, the salespeople just weren't interested in encouraging her to take merchandise, or even telling her what they had in stock. The store suddenly felt the glory of the Kennedys was not the glory of Saks Fifth Avenue anymore, and was not cost-effective. The major aggravation was that a lot of times the merchandise would come back damaged. Belts were missing, or other things were missing from the dresses. Some of the dresses had been worn. The items weren't always returned in good condition. If it was an important dress, then it couldn't be easily replaced, and that was kind of a thing that happened. It was very annoying for the store and the salespeople because nobody makes money off of damaged merchandise. Saks would try to recover the belt, and someone would call Mrs. Kennedy and say the store had received the returned merchandise, but a belt seems to be missing from such and such a piece. And the answer would be, well, we'll look for it. If we find it, we'll send it back. But it never came back. If Ethel Kennedy was running a ship, it wasn't very tight. Secondly, Ethel would keep the merchandise out of circulation for a lengthy period of time, and that doesn't help a sales department. Other incidents involving Ethel's shopping behavior began to surface in the 70s. The talk emanated from merchants and salespeople who savored such gossip, especially about the rich and famous. Because of Ethel's prominence, the stories eventually came to the attention of gossip columnists, such as Diana McClellan, who wrote The Ear in the Washington Star. Years later, those stories couldn't be confirmed because the memories of the merchants and the salespeople involved had become clouded, or because they didn't want to embarrass the woman whom they felt had suffered enough. As Alice Deneen, who had headed the Regency Room, the couture salon at the Chevy Chase, Saks Fifth Avenue, and who had often served Ethel, put it, she definitely had her foibles and eccentricities. In fact, she was unique, but she had terrible tragedies, and I don't think that she should be torn down. There isn't a woman customer alive that at one time or another doesn't give you a problem, especially people in prominent places like Ethel Kennedy. Well, yeah, I see what Oppenheimer is saying in that people's memories had changed and they didn't necessarily want to be super catty. But if you go back to somebody and you ask what were they like, and they try to give you some kind of adjusted picture, and they use such phrases as, she definitely had her foibles and eccentricities, in fact she was unique, I think we know exactly what old Alice Deneen is trying to tell us. But listen, this is the story that really made an impression on me. This whole Bloomingdale story is insane. When Bloomingdale's, the trendy New York department store, opened 2 stores in the affluent Northern Virginia and Maryland suburbs of Washington, Ethel became a spirited customer. After a few experiences with her, though, the Bloomies people, like clerks at other stores, wanted to take cover when they saw her coming. One disturbing incident that made the rounds, once again, involved the return of merchandise. Not long after Ethel had purchased a comforter at the Tyson's corner store, she returned it in soiled condition. She had it cleaned and then instructed one of her cooks to take it back and get the credit. One of her cooks? What business does the cook have to do with this comforter? I mean, if anybody would be returning merchandise, it would be one of her secretaries, one of her assistants. Poor cook's just trying to keep up with the latest menu. The employee complained, but Ethel insisted, and with great embarrassment he followed her instructions. It wasn't until later, as Bloomingdale employees were putting the merchandise back in stock, that they noticed the stains. But store management refused to make a stink about it because of Ethel's prominence. Around the same time, the Washington Post's gossip column, VIP, reported that, quote, when Bloomingdale's employees slip off to the 40 carats for a health juice break these days, they amuse each other with accounts of Ethel Kennedy's shopping problems in outfitting her younger sons. One source says that outfits purchased the day before the dedication of the JFK Library in Massachusetts came back the day after. It was assumed they did not fit or weren't suitable. On another occasion, Ethel arrived at the Bloomingdale's White Flint Mall store in Bethesda, Maryland, and for some 5 hours, using the store's personal shopping service, at your service, bought several $1,000s worth of towels, glasses, sheets, men's shirts and sweaters, skirts and women's sweaters, most of it on sale. The saleswoman who accompanied Ethel recalled how difficult she was. She would go into the fitting room and try things on and throw the garments that she didn't like on the floor, and I had to go in and hang it all up. I mean, she was a real slob. A month after Ethel's shopping spree, the saleswoman received a telephone call from the secretary of the store manager at the Tyson's Corner store in Virginia. She said, "Did you sell all these things to Mrs. Kennedy? The chauffeur is here returning everything, and half the things have no tickets on them, and half the things look worn, and half the things are disheveled, and they're all balled up together. There's so much stuff here, and he doesn't have a sales ticket," recalled the saleswoman. Ethel had sent the whole schmear back, every last piece, and she wanted the credit. I said, "Well, yes, she did come over here before Christmas, and she bought a whale of a lot of stuff." She said, "Well, it's all over here, and I think the best thing to do is to put it in a van and send it over there." I don't think she wanted to take it back, and they wanted to see what I had to say about the condition of the merchandise. After talking to Tyson's, the saleswoman telephoned Hickory Hill and reached out to one of Ethel's secretaries, who explained that Mrs. Kennedy had changed her mind, and she decided she didn't need or want the merchandise. The saleswoman said it appeared that some of the clothing had been worn, and if that was the case, it should be sent back to Hickory Hill, and the Bloomingdales would expect payment. The secretary, who was very snotty, said, "Mrs. Kennedy won't put up with that. She's not going to accept any of it back." I said, "Well, Mr. Bloomingdale and Mr. Traub won't put up with it either." About a week later, Ethel's purchase arrived at the White Flint store. "It could have come from JCPenney's for all I knew," recalled the saleswoman. "It was just a pile of clothing and household debris, including a toaster and some other stuff thrown in." Most of the items, according to the saleswoman, were shipped back to Ethel. "Of course she didn't pay her bill. And I heard New York closed her account," she said. "If there is an excessive amount of returns on an account, they close it." Can you even? Imagine the gall of just balling up a bunch of junk, throwing it at, somebody who worked for you, and then saying, "Return this stuff, please. I don't know where it came from." Literally a toaster, clothing with food stains, disheveled, broken, used, and thinking that the store is supposed to take it back. What are they supposed to do with all this broken stuff, all these junky clothes, all these dirty linens? What are they supposed to do with this? The entitlement of just using up a bunch of merchandise and then just throwing it back at the store and being like, "But you guys got this right." I would hate to work for her. I don't like returning things under the best of conditions. One, it's just a hassle. But I just can't imagine wearing something and returning it. But then also wearing something, spilling something all over it, not cleaning it, and then think I could bring it back. What? I can't. Now, the book goes on to say that whenever she visited the Kennedys' Palm Beach mansion, Ethel's first order of business would be a trip to Worth Avenue. She'd go to the stores, and she'd buy sweaters and shorts, not dressy things, and she'd wear them during her visit. And then, when she left to fly home, she'd leave them piled up in my office for me to return, said Barbara Gibson. When Mrs. Kennedy found out, she told me to give the things to the chauffeur to return. The people in the stores were used to getting the stuff back. When they saw me coming with the clothing, they'd laugh and say, "Here she comes," write out the little credit slip. It really was a joke after a while. The store owners wrote it off as PR. All those things that she went out and she bought extravagantly, she would return. Ethel had gotten a reputation for not paying and for being very cheap. But was it just clothing as household items that Ethel would buy, return, in used and abused conditions? No. Because Ethel was cheap now regarding everything. The book goes on to say that by the end of the 70s, Ethel's arrogance towards merchants reached its zenith when she was sued by a small catering service for failure to pay a $535 bill for a rush Christmas dinner that she ordered while vacationing in Aspen with Ted and some of her children. Ethel had returned to the condo with some 24 guests and had suddenly decided on a big Christmas dinner, said Noelle Fell. She asked one of the maids, who was an excellent cook herself and could have prepared the meal, to get a caterer. Mrs. Kennedy was in a bad mood that day. David had been there and was causing a ruckus, so she was not very happy. The maid finally talked to the caterer into preparing the dinner, but they told her that it would cost more because they had to pay their people overtime. The maid told Mrs. Kennedy, and Mrs. Kennedy told her, "It doesn't matter what it costs, just have it done." But after Ethel and her guests ate the dinner, Ethel refused to pay the bill, claiming that Dean Small and Tom Gerlach, the owners, had overcharged her for the 12-pound roast, green beans, a dip, chips, baked potatoes, French bread, and a dessert, a huge walnut cookie cake with raspberry and pecan filling. Small said he gave the bill to Ethel the day after Christmas. She was really furious. He recalled her saying, "The whole meal's worth $25. Well, yeah, maybe the food wasn't that much, but you wanted it served to you by a catering staff. People have to get paid. And it was a rush job, so you have to pay for things like that. Not only didn't she want to pay the bill, recalled Noelle Fell, but she was pissed off at the maid because she had agreed to the price. Now that she'd impressed her friends with the dinner, she didn't care what happened. As the wheels of justice ground forward, Ethel tried to get out of appearing publicly in court, but the judge denied her motion to testify in depositions. Ethel gave the appearance that she was taking the matter lightly. Prior to the scheduled trial date, in an oblique reference to the case, she sent out valentines to friends showing her dressed in a maid's uniform serving a turkey. The caption said she'd cater, even if you sue. It's a weird valentine. Although, as we're going to go on to read, she was sort of taken with these weird Valentine's cards she'd send out from time to time. Anyway, a week before the trial, Ethel reached an out-of-court settlement with the caterers for a sum that was satisfactory to both parties, Small said at the time. They claimed to have no animosity towards Mrs. Kennedy, and they said, "We feel that we were just in what we did and what we charged. We'd serve her in the future if the payment was made in advance." And that is where we end today. I know it's a little bit of a shorter episode, but the next chapter that we're going to talk about is really too long to fit into this episode, so we'll just make that its own episode. But you guys, please comment below. What was Ethel doing? Why is her house such a mess? I don't understand why Ethel was in the situation that she was financially. I mean, I understand that there was no money, but I mean, with all of the financial resources that she had, all the people, all the staff, all these individuals who are wanting her to cut down on her spending, why was it that they didn't have somebody in-house taking care of her money? Lem Billings, he's too busy trying to keep charge of these kids and taking them off for trips to Africa and trying to figure out what's going on with the kids overdosing. It's he's the wrong person to say, and Lem, you're in charge of making sure she doesn't spend. It seemed like there was all these random people who sort of had, dibs on trying to control portions and parts of her spending. They needed a dedicated individual in that house to be all bills go through me, and I will be the one. And I'm sure that nobody was volunteering for that job. But if they really wanted her to get her spending under control, calling her from New York and being hey, your food bill's out of control, and then expecting her to know or to care or to have the tools, the wherewithal, the will to change those spending habits. I mean, everyone's frustrated with Ethel. Y'all know who the problem is. It is Ethel. Make sure she cannot spend. Take her credit cards. Take her ability to access the money. Do what you need to do. Y'all know tricks. Y'all know some financial tricks up there in New York, Steve Smith. He's as slick as they come. He could have put some kind of kibosh on this spending if he so chose and so willed. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Was everybody just perpetually in the mood to be annoyed with Ethel? I have no idea. But she seems like she was a real pain in the butt when it came to spending money and you had to control her spending. Why didn't they get somebody in the house to make sure she wasn't spending this money? I'll never understand it. Stay tuned for the next episode. It is entitled Ethel and Andy. And when I tell you that I was gobsmacked, I was gobsmacked. Not even so much about the relationship between Ethel and Andy, but the kind of relationship that Ethel, Claudine, Bobby, and Ethel had before his untimely passing. What's going on there? I hope you guys can help me figure it out. Maybe I'm reading in too much to some of the weird cards and pictures they were sending to each other, but that was a weird relationship. And you will never make me not think that that was a weird relationship. Unless one of you guys has a really compelling argument. I don't know. It's weird and I want to talk to you guys about it. So next episode, it's all about Ethel and Andy now that he's not with Claudine anymore and her husband has passed away. Their relationship is strange, but again, it's a relationship that all four of them had before the passing that really raises my eyebrows to the sky. So I'm excited about that episode, but I really want to hear about your comments about this episode. Please tell me what you think about this. Did any of this surprise you or did you know all this already? I didn't. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks for hanging out. Bye.